I'm Emily Campagno.
I'm Guy Benson.
I'm Shannon Bream, and this is the Fox News Rundown. Wednesday, May 12th, 2021. I'm Lisa Brady. For some parents, remote learning has been a crash course on what their kids are being taught. Could that make school choice a campaign issue?
I think the more parents are aware of all of these options, the more they might want to elect someone who gives them the opportunity to make a choice.
We speak with Fox's Martha MacCallum.
I'm Chris Foster. China's population growth has slowed down, but not its global ambitions.
I think there's a big uncertainty around to what extent population is going to continue to be the primary driver of a country's power.
And I'm Jim Daly. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Getting America vaccinated against COVID-19 has consumed just about everything for months now, and it's not over yet.
We have to make it easier and more convenient for all Americans to get vaccinated. You're busting your neck doing that.
President Biden thanking a bipartisan group of governors during a virtual meeting on Tuesday and rolling out new efforts, including free Uber and Lyft rides to get a shot and a partnership with McDonald's to promote the We Can Do This campaign. But mass vaccination hasn't reopened all schools. In fact, the administration has faced more questions about how much influence the teachers' unions have after emails suggesting union input in CDC guidelines.
The objective is to have a better understanding of implementation, how it would work.
White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki telling reporters they heard from a variety of organizations about the return to in-person learning. But in some districts, what kids are learning has taken center stage as a new curriculum sparks intense debate.
A lot of families, when their kids were home, Zoom learning, which in many places they still are. In fact, I spoke with Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education, and she told me that 98% of students in California are still learning from home.
Martha MacCallum is host of The Story on Fox News Channel and the Untold Story podcast.
So one of the interesting outgrowths of all of this Zoom learning was that a lot of parents got a closer look at exactly what their kids were learning in school, and some of what they saw, some of them didn't like very much. And so now that a lot of kids are going back to school, a lot of parents are questioning whether or not they approve of some of what's being taught. And that has brought the entire issue of the 1619 Project and critical race theory into the conversation across the country. So on the one side, it's great that kids are going back to school. On the other side, some parents aren't really that happy with what's going on in their school. And one place where it's come to a head is in Texas. In a small district in Texas, you had two school board members who won overwhelming school board elections running on a platform of eliminating critical race theory from the classroom. And you also have some governors across the country in Idaho and Montana and Oklahoma who have said it's against the law to teach critical race theory in schools across the country. So it's getting a lot of attention. I think there's a little bit of a tide turning on this, at least in terms of people's understanding of what's going on.
I guess part of the driving force behind the debate is that, it's one thing to want more inclusion and to want to kind of look at things differently and with a more open mind, if you will. But then the argument against this is really that it's going too far, that it's making, white kids feel like they're inherently racist or that the country is inherently racist.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the issue is that the 1619 Project lays out an alternative view of the founding of the country. It bases it in a need or a desire on the part of the colonists and the first Americans, or the first settlers who colonized America, and then the Declaration of Independence and the founders. It takes it away from that and moves it more to a question of coming to this country in order to preserve slavery. And one scholar, Gordon Wood, who has studied this time period extensively, writes that there's no evidence that the colonists that was a primary motivating factor for them coming to this country and beginning this country, that at the same time in Great Britain there was an effort to end slavery, and that was not something that was spoken about, written about, made part of the desire to come and begin a new country. And we also know that during 1776 there was a debate about slavery and about wanting to end slavery in this country, and the question of whether or not they could get through the Declaration of Independence and Constitution process if they made it part of that document. And there were strong feelings that they should make it part of that document. And we know that it came later, and there's a lot of understandable historical debate over why that was and why it wasn't done earlier in the process. But to suggest that the country is founded on a desire to preserve slavery has been called out as just simply historically inaccurate. And so I think that obviously you want accurate teaching to our students, and you want them to not necessarily view the nation as founded and steeped in something evil as its foundational prospect, because I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary.
When you pressed the American Federation of Teachers president, Randi Weingarten, about this,
do you favor teaching students that 1619 is more important than 1776? Do you favor that?
She didn't really answer that question directly, but I'm wondering if talking to her gave you any new perspective on this.
I was a bit taken aback that she was simplistic about her interpretation of what it is. She suggested that teaching the 1619 project, and I pointed out that there are educational materials and curriculum materials that have been sent to schools across the country, and in fact, grant money has been linked to the usage of some of these materials by the Biden administration. So it's very much an element of curriculum that's being considered across the country. But she suggested that it was simply acknowledging that the first slave ship came here in 1619, which I don't think there's a lot of debate about. I think that obviously is part of history. It's an acknowledged part of history. It's the larger questions that she sort of ignored. And then she said, we have to teach 1619 and 1776. So we know that those two things are in conflict, or the 1776 founding is questioned by the 1619 project. So it seemed that she just had a very simplistic view of what's being taught and what's part of that program that I don't think reflects the reality of what the program argues.
Do you think that President Biden will face more questions at some point about union influence the way the CDC director recently did? Because that's been a part of, recent debates about what's happening in schools as well.
I think it's clear that the teachers' unions have an enormous amount of influence at the White House, that they dictated quite a bit in terms of keeping schools closed. If you remember, the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, said that she felt that it was safe to reopen the schools and that teachers didn't necessarily have to be vaccinated for kids to go back. And that was quickly followed up by the White House saying that she was speaking in her personal capacity when she said that, not as the head of CDC, which was a difficult argument to make given the fact that she was sitting with an entire CDC wall backdrop behind her when she was saying this. But it was clear that they wanted to rein that in. And I also think, based on what we know, it's logical to assume that the unions were not happy with her saying that in that interview, because we know that they have felt very strongly that teachers needed to have the option to not return to school based on what they say is science, and yet it runs aground when you look at the science that we've seen in terms of the extremely low transmission rates in school environments. So I think that it is safe to say that there's quite a bit of influence that the unions have in the White House. I think they were very frustrated that they didn't have much influence at all in the prior administration, but certainly they do have a lot of influence now. We've seen it.
Will these kinds of school issues, and I guess this is one of those million-dollar questions, potentially affect the midterm elections? For instance, maybe Republicans would talk more about school choice.
I think that's absolutely true. I spoke with Betsy DeVos about that, the former education secretary. She's been a long-time advocate of school choice. And one of the interesting outcomes from the past year has been a greater interest in having more choices, because you saw Catholic schools reopening, you saw charter schools in many cases reopening, private schools reopening. So depending on people's ability to pay for those options, they were choosing them if they could. And if they couldn't, they started to pay more attention to the idea of school choice, that you could have portable tax dollars that you could choose to designate to the school that you want your child to go to. So I think the more parents are aware of all of these options, the more they might want to elect someone who gives them the opportunity to make a choice.
One of the most heated debates around the country and on Capitol Hill right now is about voting rights.
Republican legislatures have seized on the big lie to restrict the franchise.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says Democrats want to make it easier to vote. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says it's a power grab.
Popular safeguards like voter ID would be neutered. Ludicrous practices like ballot harvesting would be mandatory coast to coast.
It's a debate that didn't start with the 2020 election, but has come to a boil since.
This is an enormous issue. You had COVID voting patterns where we saw mail-in voting at levels that we've never seen in the country before, and extended windows for voting, and drop-off mailboxes for voting. All of this was designed because there was, I think, a justifiable concern about having a presidential election in the middle of a pandemic. So in many ways, the rules were changed around the country, each state handling it the way they saw fit, to make it easier for people to vote. Now, because of, I think in part because of the outcome, Democrats want to enshrine a lot of those changes and expand them. And Republicans have a fear that some of these expansions of ability to vote opened the window for potential fraud. For instance, ballot harvesting. If you can drop off 40 ballots in a box, there's a lack of chain of custody of the person who filled out that ballot and means to vote by it. So it's a really important debate, and it's something that I think all Americans should pay very close attention to. It's going to have a major impact on elections to come.
That kind of dovetails into the fight over stripping Congresswoman Liz Cheney of her leadership position in the House as well, because she's been so critical of President Trump's election fraud claims. More broadly, how big a problem is that for the Republican Party?
Well, I think the feeling is very divided over this issue, and I think there are understandable arguments on both sides. Senator Joni Ernst said that she sees the removal of Liz Cheney and her leadership position in the Republican Party as cancel culture for her speaking out about what she sees as the big lie in terms of the former president's interpretation of what happened in the election. And then on the other hand, you have party leaders such as Minority Leader McCarthy, Senator Lindsey Graham, who I just spoke to about this, who say there's nothing wrong with expressing your opinion about the prior election, but we need leadership that is going to unify the party, and they believe that the only way to success is a Trump bust model where people embrace the Trump voter and look to add people to the party. So it's a significant struggle, and I think that Democrats will want to encourage that struggle. Any division in the Republican Party is going to be of benefit to Democrats moving forward. So we'll see how it sorts out.
Fox's Martha MacCallum, we appreciate you following it all, and thanks for spending so much time with us.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.
This is Jim Daly with your Fox News commentary coming up.
The Chinese government used to be so worried about population growth it had a one-child-per-couple policy. Now they could really use some babies there. New census figures out of China show population growth basically flat over the last 10 years, adding around 7 million people per year, with the population now 1.41 billion. That percentage increase is the smallest since China started conducting a census in 1953. Births have fallen 4 years in a row. 12 million last year is the fewest since 1961 after a widespread famine had killed millions of people. It's unclear what exactly the effect will be on China's economy or anything else, at least right now. It's still considered the second or third most powerful country in the world, depending on what you think of Russia.
There's a status issue when you recognize that the population that they have been trying to expand for some time, and they removed the one-child policy at the beginning of Xi Jinping's first term. It didn't really make a difference.
Ian Bremmer is president and founder of the Eurasia Group and the host of GZERO World with Ian Bremmer on PBS.
It's aligned with power, status, prestige, They have with their 5-year plan right now, they're talking about a dual circulation policy. That is an orientation towards greater reliance for growth on their own domestic market. It's really hard to grow your domestic market when your population is flat. So it does have meaning for all of those reasons, but I would caution about reading too much into it.
Yeah, it looks like, talking about status, it looks like India will pass them for the most populous country in, 4 or 5 years. Now, you mentioned China famously had this one-child policy in place after decades of exploding population. It became a two-child policy about 5 years ago. Not everybody followed it, but there was, in some cases, forced contraception, forced sterilization. Besides the morality of it, did the Chinese government at some point really miscalculate regarding their demographics?
Yeah, I think they have for a long time. The view that a simple shift by the government into a pro-natalist stance without any of the economic or political, social support that would get people to change their behavior just doesn't move the needle. The only major country around that has implemented a pro-natalist policy that really worked was France. And there it was combined with, a smaller work week, with enormous support for maternity leave, for a whole host of social contract and spending that made the average French person feel like building a family was a really smart thing to do. In China, that just has never been an accompanied piece of policy.
Yeah. The birth rate here is slow, too, for some of the same reasons. A lot of people say they're waiting because they can't afford a big enough home, or they just can't afford a kid in general. They want to get their careers going, and those are the same concerns that young couples, I assume, have in China.
That's right, of course. Again, populations have been leveling off around the world. Also, as you get wealthier and you get more educated, the only part of the world that is experiencing truly explosive growth right now is sub-Saharan Africa. And no surprise, it's by far the poorest, the least educated, the most rural, and women are in by far the worst position. As all of those things change with globalization and a growing economy, you're going to see population trends in sub-Saharan Africa decline as well.
How much does population really matter? They certainly have enough people to have their military and to have a workforce, right?
I think that's a big question. Over the last 50 years, you weren't going to experience growth unless you had more people in your population, because that was how you drove capital, was you needed a labor force. In fact, China's been the factory for global manufacturing. But, in the United States, increasingly, if you don't have a college degree, there isn't work for you. Well, that's happening all over the world with automation and robotics and artificial intelligence. And even though China's workforce is really flattening, it's plateauing, and it will decrease, China's data explosion, bigger than that of any other country in the world, is only continuing to expand. And if it turns out that you don't need as much working labor, but what you really do need is data that you can mine and exploit and make profit out of, well, there the Chinese are not only number one in the world right now, but that gap is actually expanding. So I think there's a big uncertainty around to what extent population is going to continue to be the primary driver of a country's power.
China has a huge propaganda operation running in the U.S., right? What's its goal, and what can or should we do about it?
Their goal has been less about breaking things in the U.S. and trying to exploit U.S. internal divisions. The Russians have done more of that. It's more trying to promote patriotism and Chinese political goals. So they want Americans of Chinese descent to be more supportive of Beijing, less of Taiwan or Hong Kong. They want more alignment with China's success in being able to beat back coronavirus, for example. They want to undermine American narratives that go after China for the initial cover-up of coronavirus, for intellectual property theft, for the Uyghur issues. Let's face it, right now, the United States not only mistrusts China, but we disagree with China on serious issues that in almost every aspect where the two countries come together, Chinese state-directed propaganda, and they're spending a lot more money on that, about 500% more in this last year than they did the year before, that is all orienting at countering that narrative.
Yeah, well, the narrative here, and maybe it's a different in national philosophies, is that people in Taiwan, people in Hong Kong should be free. And there, the narrative is that no, they should be part of our great nation of China. Will Taiwan and Hong Kong even be independent in a few years, if you can say, to the extent that they are now?
Hong Kong is not independent. Hong Kong, the idea of one state and two systems has been unilaterally abrogated by the Chinese Communist Party. There is no more democracy in Hong Kong. Free speech and freedom of press has been fundamentally eroded. So has rule of law. Hong Kong's economic capabilities are still very strong because they're getting integrated into a very robust and much larger mainland Chinese economy. But you can no longer say that there's meaningful freedom in Hong Kong. Taiwan is still very much independent. And even though the United States does not formally recognize it as a separate state, the United States does provide lots of defense capacity so that the Taiwanese can defend themselves against mainland China and can maintain rule of law and a separate political system. And for now, that continues to persist. But certainly over time, that is a major flashpoint between the U.S. and China.
Yeah. We hear about the civil rights abuses and the lack of labor protections in China. Was it always a myth that China was eventually going to become this, freer capitalist society? Or was that something that's been curtailed, or was it never to be? It was never to be that as the Chinese got wealthier, that they were going to become American. It was never to be that they were going to implement democracy or a free market. They need heavy capital controls to keep the Chinese from taking their cash out of the country. And the Chinese economy is run largely by the state. They are the most important economic actor in the United States. That's the private sector. So it's a very different system. There have been meaningful reforms in China over the last decades, and that has led to a flourishing of many, not just multinational corporations in the U.S. making a lot of money in China, but also China's own private sector that does operate at least somewhat independently from the Communist Party. But under Xi Jinping, who is by far the strongest leader that China's had since Mao, I would argue there's been more consolidation of control. There has been less freedom for people like Jack Ma, for example, who has, basically been seriously punished for trying to act independently from the Chinese leadership. I would argue that they ended term limits for the Chinese president. If anything, there's been a bit of backsliding, but China was never going to be an open free market democracy. That was a presumption made by the foreign policy establishment in the United States for many decades, Republicans and Democrats, and a mistaken one. Yeah, well, we probably just in the way that we do thought, well, everybody wants to be American eventually. We thought the same thing about the Soviet Union. Yeah, and that's not a very credible thing to say, right? Especially given what's happened in the United States. The events of January 6th, the massive divisions in this country, the fact that a majority of people that voted for Trump believe that the election was stolen by Biden. The United States is not very legitimate at promoting a free market and a representative democracy. Canada would be more effective. Germany would be more effective. Japan would be more effective. The problem is those countries aren't very powerful. The United States is by far the most powerful, even if it's less legitimate in terms of its democracy. And so that does erode America's soft power and its ability to provide a roadmap both for allies more aligned with the United States and for adversaries who are basically saying, United States, look at you. You have no moral authority to tell us what to do. Finally, Ian, just coronavirus. More than a year ago, you were on this show talking about how little credibility they have on the issue. They still really do. Is that the kind of thing that could hurt their world influence, or does their money and military power just trump all that? Oh, no, it hurts them a lot. The fact that the Chinese lied about the initial human-to-human transfer
of coronavirus is a massive delegitimizer of the Chinese government. The fact that their vaccines don't work very well, and they've not been transparent with the international community or with their own people, is a serious problem. The United States is now positioned to have the most effective vaccine diplomacy with the best vaccines and the most vaccines to export in the world in short order in the next couple of months. And that is a significant American advantage vis-a-vis China. I mean, it's true that countries don't trust the Americans as much as they did 20 or 30 years ago, but it's also true that they trust the Americans a lot more than they trust the Chinese. And that persists. If anything, coronavirus has expanded that gap.
Ian Bremmer is president and founder of the Eurasia Group. He's the host of GZERO World with Ian Bremmer on PBS. Ian, thanks for coming on the Fox News Rundown.
Great to be with you.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network.
I'm Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, and I'm inviting you to join a new conversation with the smartest thinkers out there about the country and where we're going. Subscribe to the Ben Domenech Podcast.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Jim Daly.
What's on your mind?
Many on the left today want to muzzle conservative Christians, and even if you're not a religious person, that should worry you. I remember being in Moscow back in August of 1991 when President Mikhail Gorbachev was put under house arrest. It was a failed coup attempt orchestrated by hardline communists in the Soviet Union's government and their military leadership. At the time, residents were being told that Mr. Gorbachev was ill. In reality, he was being held hostage, but glimpses of truth began leaking out. Western news reports were being plastered all over the walls of Moscow. A great buzz began spreading in the streets as people in the city heard the news and read it. I've seen it elsewhere too. I've been in several authoritarian countries where government officials monitored the Christian church very closely and allowed them only limited freedoms. I was told by Christians in those countries that the communist government would only tolerate so much before cracking down and silencing any expression of faith. I was curious and asked them why. The answer was always the same. These Christians would say it's because the party fears the power of the church. The Communist Party wants to be the only power people are allowed to follow. Sadly, I believe I'm seeing the same trend in the United States today. With increasing frequency, progressives say they don't want religion in the public square. Big tech wants to edit what religious leaders can say. What's happening? It's obvious to many of us that left-leaning thought leaders in our country's power centers, like educators, political and business leaders, and sports organizations, are trying to ensure that religious expression doesn't challenge the state's ideological narrative or their power. In other words, the values imposed by politicians and their allies must be followed, period. And this sounds eerily similar to what my Christian friends describe in totalitarian countries. From bakers and florists to faith-based adoption services, tolerance for Christians and their conservative beliefs have tanked to all-time lows. People who support beliefs in the Bible are being targeted. It's breathtaking to watch a culture flip so quickly. Ancient truths that have helped establish our nation as the most prosperous, innovative, generous, and vibrant are now being tipped upside down to pursue hate, division, grievances, and other destructive paths. As a Christian, I embrace what the Apostle Paul stated when he declared, "Our citizenship is in heaven. It's not here. Yes, we give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but we ultimately answer to God, not government." And I believe God's laws trump any earthly edict, yet this first devotion is neither problematic nor something to fear, unless those in power want to force people of faith to violate their conscience and deeply held convictions. That's because committed Christians make excellent citizens, always looking to serve others and point people to the world yet to come. This is Jim Daly, president of Focus on the Family.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Jason in the House, the Jason Chaffetz podcast. Dive deeper than the headlines and the party lines as I take on American life, politics, and entertainment. Subscribe now on FoxNewsPodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts.